Here's a video I want to cover because there's been a development apparently.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown. So, Glenn, a really important move here by the DOJ. They've come out and said that Trump is not entitled to absolute immunity against civil lawsuits that are seeking to hold him liable for the January 6th insurrection. Can you explain what this means and why this is important?
Yeah, so Brian, ordinarily citizens can't sue a president. Can you imagine if citizens could drag a president into court at their will and force him or her to begin litigating these civil suits? A president has extremely broad protection or immunity against being sued. So what happened here was because Donald Trump incited a violent attack on the Capitol on January 6th, and he put everybody in harm's way, some Capitol police officers and some members of Congress, some representatives, sued Donald Trump, saying, you know what, we don't think you should enjoy presidential immunity because what you did was so far beyond the scope of your presidential duties that we have to be permitted to sue you for the damage you caused to us. So what the court was wrestling...
Well, let's go a step further than that, because, he was an interim president at the time. He had been voted out of office. So at this point, he was transitioning into a private citizen, right? And on the occasion, he was literally trying to stop the validation of the delegate votes, the Electoral College, that the validation of those votes, certifying that Biden was the new president. So despite whether the inauguration took place, I think on January 20th, right? It took place a little bit later. But I don't think that would matter because he was already fired. You're fired. He was already fired at that point. And I don't think that even in a situation of having presidential protections, that you can tear up the office place on your way out the door simply because you're unhappy that you were fired.
With was... what Donald Trump did on and around January 6th, part of his official presidential duties such that nobody should be allowed to sue him, or was it well outside his presidential duties so that he doesn't have immunity and he can be sued?
And so is it customary for the DOJ to get out in front of this thing like they did with this pronouncement? And beyond that, what is this signal?
Snap your W-2 and file Fed and State for free. Simple tax returns only. See if you qualify.
Yeah, it's really kind of an interesting posture because if we back up a little bit, some Capitol Police officers and members of Congress sued Donald Trump. And in the trial court, Donald Trump said, I'm moving to dismiss this case because you can't sue me no matter what I say, no matter what I do. Really, his defense was pretty breathtaking in its lawlessness, in its callousness, and in its depravity, because his attorneys expressly
in other words, completely on brand for Donald Trump.
Right.
Exactly what we would expect from Donald.
Where did he even find his attorneys that they live in such a fantasy world of making up arguments like this? Apparently, he's searching all over the place for people who are willing to come up with ridiculous arguments to defend his behavior. And he was listening to people who apparently had close access to him who were telling him he could get away with it. But it sounds like, based on the the stuff that's coming out from the grand jury investigation, is that the majority of the campaign staff around him was telling him, no, dude, you lost. Even Fox News people, Hannity, they're all like, hey, dude, you lost. And then they all just fucking decided to go along with it. They're just like, okay, well, you've got such a huge brand name. Really? You got such a huge brand name? Oh my God, even.
Trump. But, what his lawyers said was Donald Trump can give a speech expressly inciting people to violently attack the Capitol, and because he's president, nobody can touch him. There's nothing anybody can do about it. He has absolute immunity. Now, he lost. in the trial court. The trial court judge, Judge Amit Mehta, ruled that no, Trump has no immunity. This suit against him can move forward. Not surprisingly, he appealed. So this gets right to your question. Is this unusual or is it routine for DOJ to weigh in like this? It's unusual, but the appellate court, which is now wrestling with Judge Mehta's decision to let this case proceed to trial, the appellate court said, you know what, DOJ, we want your opinion. We want you to tell us if you, the executive branch, the Department of Justice, believe Donald Trump should be subject to a lawsuit here or whether he should be absolutely immune. And really importantly,
well, and this is an important distinction because this sets up the case law moving forward that you can't have a president who has lost, who is a lame duck president at that point, try and abuse their position to incite riots and treason and insurrection. Like, that can't be a thing.
DOJ weighed in and they said, we believe he acted well outside his official duties as president, inciting an imminent violent attack on the Capitol, and we believe he can be sued for that, so he has no immunity. What does that portend for other cases? Well, I think it could potentially open the floodgates. There's nothing to say that other individuals who were harmed by Donald Trump's conduct on January 6th can't now file suit if they choose to. About a dozen or so people have filed suit in this one, Capitol Police officers and representatives. But we both know there were a whole lot more people in the Capitol that day who were injured as a result of Donald Trump's, inspired attack.
So we haven't heard a lot about this case in particular. We focus a lot on the Fulton County one, the New York State AG's case, and the DOJ's cases. Obviously, can you give a little more insight into this case and kind of what's at stake for Donald Trump here? Because I guess monetarily or damage wise, like what could he be on the hook for?
Yeah, importantly, this is a civil case. So this will not result in Donald Trump being convicted of a crime or going to prison. This is about money. It's about damages. So the people who brought suit said, we were injured. And you don't have to be physically injured. I mean, you can be psychologically injured. And let's face it, everybody in the Capitol that day suffered some very real damage.
I certainly hope Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is one of the people, because she was receiving all kinds of death threats and they were coming after her directly. She was definitely one of the assassination targets. And so I certainly hope that she is going to try and pursue some legal consequences here as well.
As a result of the president instructing a bunch of Americans to attack the Capitol to stop Joe Biden's certification. So what we're dealing with here is money. And if they win the lawsuit, then they'll have to prove damages. How much should they be awarded? But, this is kind of more akin to the suit that's being brought up in New York by Letitia James, the New York Attorney General, that is seeking monetary damages as a result of the Trump Organization and Trump and his adult children running that organization as a corrupt enterprise. And it kind of has less in common with the Georgia proceeding where, he may very well be indicted criminally, and the Department of Justice criminal probe.
Can Trump challenge this position by the...
Yeah, so what I was saying about Trump was riding on the fact that he had a brand name, and this is why a lot of people just went, a lot of the higher ups and attorneys and campaign and Fox News tried to jump on board with him with his big lie and his bullshit, is because they saw Trump as a brand name, because Mark Burnett basically made him. Like, he had a name in the 80s. His name got dropped on Cheers, right? Because Kirstie Alley's character had a big crush on him back in the 80s. But he's always been a failure. He's always been a massive failure. But you know what? A lot of people at the top fail forward. They get in just because they have a name. And they're able to just build up their resume and say, look at all this shit I've done. Did I do it well? Maybe not so much. I worked for a company in which I was having a serious problem with the manager of my department because she was super jealous of me, and so she was doing incredibly weird stuff, like took me out to a lunch to try and threaten me so that it would be one-on-one and there would be no witnesses. You know, there was a lot of stuff going on. And when I went to complain to the HR director about this, I noticed that she had a Trump bust in her office. How can you possibly, and this was in 2015, he was already announced as a candidate. How can you possibly trust an HR representative who has such a political statement right there in the office? You know, like, the only leadership roles I've really held have either been political entirely, so it's like everybody knows what my politics are, or I have not brought my politics into it whatsoever. In fact, one of the managers I reported to in a different company, he was constantly going off on liberal politics, his democratic viewpoints. And it even made me uncomfortable because it wasn't the appropriate place to demonstrate your political beliefs. We should have been focusing on work. We should have been focusing on the things that we needed to do to make the company run. And so when you bring that sort of shit into the office, it makes it impossible for you to work with everybody in your department. Like, you can only work with certain people who agree with you, and even if they agree with you, they might still be uncomfortable that you're bringing that into the office. Like I said, I was uncomfortable that he kept bringing this stuff up, despite the fact that I am very progressive. I am very much on the left, and the fact that he kept bringing that up in staff meetings was really fucking weird to me.
DOJ, is there any way for him to appeal this position by the DOJ?
Yeah, you know, it's a really interesting question because it's in this unusual posture. So the appellate court has it right now, and the appellate court has to decide whether to let the lawsuit proceed or say, no, you know what, we need to throw it out because Trump really does have immunity. And because the DOJ weighed in with what in essence is an advisory opinion, DOJ said, no, based on our assessment, we do not believe Donald Trump is immune from this lawsuit. That opinion is not really something that Donald Trump can appeal. What he can do is wait for that opinion to be considered by the appellate court judges, wait for the appellate court to decide the case, and if it goes against him, then he can appeal that up to the Supreme Court.
No, is Trump losing absolute immunity because of what's called imminent private violence? Is that similar? Is that like the equivalent of him losing the ability to claim executive privilege because of the crime fraud exception? Because basically he's not protected when he behaves outside the scope of his role as president or outside the scope of the law?
I'm a father of 3 and a grandfather of 5. I've been a school teacher all my life, and
You know, that's a really good comparison. If we take a step back, there is something called forfeiture by wrongdoing. And it really is a universal principle in the law. Sometimes it's called the clean hands doctrine, right? If you have unclean hands, if you've done something dirty or criminal or underhanded, you shouldn't be able to benefit from that. So in the executive privilege arena, when he's trying to stop all of these other former executive branch officials from testifying about his crimes, you know, the law says, well, no, you might have an executive privilege because ordinarily we don't want government officials to testify about the conversations they have when they're conducting legitimate federal government business. But if you're acting outside the scope of that legitimate federal government business and you're, you know, conspiring to overthrow a government or conspiring to deny a politician, you know, his election win, then you can't.
You know, Trump will always go down in the history books compared to Hitler. He's always going to be compared to Hitler. And the fact is that we actually do have what is it? I think the 25th Amendment. We did have protections in our Constitution, but because y'all elected so many goddamn fascists across the country, there was no way that we could actually use the protections within our Constitution to do something about this absolute clown who killed people. And that he has blood on his hands for what he did that day. And he tried to get Mike Pence assassinated. You know, I disagree with Mike Pence's politics entirely. But like I said on one of my other more recent videos, I don't want anybody dead just because I disagree with them. And it's absolutely shocking that he has such disregard for the loss of human life.
Can't start claiming privileges. The same, I think, does hold true with this recent, opinion from the Department of Justice. You cannot claim absolute immunity because you weren't acting as a president. Right. You were acting outside what we will allow and tolerate from a president when you're inciting and inspiring imminent private violence. You can't, that will not, you will not enjoy any privileges if that's the way you've behaved.
Now, Glenn, let's finish off with this. Would the DOJ have issued this if it didn't portend legal action against Trump, in your opinion?
Yeah, so there is little doubt in my mind that this takes the Department of Justice one step further down the road of indicting Donald Trump. The reason I say that is because in this opinion, they say he can be sued because he wasn't acting the way a president is permitted to act. And they also say that his conduct doesn't enjoy First Amendment protection because it really was reasonably likely to, and in fact, sort of designed to incite imminent violence. So those are important opinions, because if the Department of Justice had gone the other way and said that what he said and did on January 6th enjoys First Amendment protection or is within the scope of a president's official duties, boy, I think that would have been a couple of steps backward on the road to a Trump criminal indictment. So yeah, this is an important step in the direction of a criminal indictment.
Okay, and one last question on this case in particular. What's the timeline here? What's the next thing that we should look out for in this case in particular, where he's lost absolute immunity and in this case brought forward by police officers for what happened on January 6th?
So the next thing we will see is the appellate court issuing an opinion. Now that they have DOJ's position that Trump doesn't have immunity, we'll have to wait for the appellate court to either say, we agree with that position and we agree with the way Judge Mehta in the trial court resolved the issue against Trump, saying that the suit can proceed against him. And the appellate court will either say yay or nay. If the appellate court reverses, discards DOJ's opinion and reverses Judge Mehta's decision, well, then the case goes away. I have a feeling they will affirm it, and the next thing we will see is Donald Trump trying to get the Supreme Court to accept review of this question. It's anybody's guess as to whether the Supreme Court will actually hear this case or not.
Okay, well, we'll add it to the laundry list of other ongoing cases that he's contending with right now. If you are watching this right now and you want to keep up with this case and others, make sure to subscribe to both of our channels. The links are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.
Wow. I think most of us want justice here. And, these arguments, obviously his lawyers were terrible to begin with, which is why there are so many lawsuits, because he was getting it in his ear that he was going to get away with this. And so he already has a history of hiring really incompetent people. And I hope that they hold not only Trump accountable for this, but also all of the attorneys, Sidney Powell, Rudy Giuliani, everybody else that was involved in helping to spread this misinformation to the public and incite a riot, incite insurrection. Dave the cat wants to get involved here. I would like to see everybody held accountable, not just Trump.